Jalen Hurts was a Super Bowl MVP just 14 months ago, outplaying Patrick Mahomes and taking down a dynasty in the process. Fast forward to today, and the national conversation has shifted towards locker room drama, fired offensive coordinators, and trade rumors involving A.J. Brown. We're seeing ESPN hit pieces fueled by anonymous sources inside the building, which makes you wonder what actually happened to change the narrative so quickly. The hate coming his way is real, but none of this actually started last season. It started 6 years ago when he entered the league. Jalen Hurts arrived at Alabama in 2016 as a top recruit and somehow actually managed to win the starting job as a true freshman. He went out and won 26 games over 2 seasons while only losing twice. Before he was even old enough to drink, he had an SEC Offensive Player of the Year award and a national championship appearance on his resume. However, everything changed when Nick Saban decided to bench him at halftime during the 2018 national championship game against Georgia. The offense looked completely dead with Alabama, and Hurts had only completed 3 passes for 21 yards at that point. Nick Saban pulled his starter for a freshman named Tua Tagovailoa, who stepped in to lead a massive comeback and threw the game-winning touchdown in OT. Tua became a legend in Tuscaloosa overnight, while Hurts was forced to stand on the sideline and watch the entire thing happen at just 19 years old. The way Saban handled the situation afterward tells you everything about how good Hurts was and how complicated his life was about to become. Instead of helping him transfer out immediately, Nick kept him as a backup for the following season. He knew that putting a former starter behind a player the whole country now loved would be one of the hardest things a competitor could ever deal with. Hurts handled the pressure by staying quiet and practicing hard, which led Nick Saban to call it one of the most impressive things he had ever seen from a player. The story comes full circle when Tua got hurt during the following SEC championship game against Georgia in the very same stadium. Alabama was down 14 points in the fourth quarter when Jalen came in off the bench to guide 2 touchdown drives. He eventually scored the winning touchdown himself on a 15-yard run with about a minute left on the clock. After the 35-28 victory, the building went absolutely insane, and Saban admitted he had never been more proud of a player in his entire career. Jalen would eventually transfer to Oklahoma the next year to play in Lincoln Riley's air raid system, which is the polar opposite of the ground game he ran at Alabama. He would throw for 3,851 yards and 32 touchdowns, finishing second in Heisman voting behind Joe Burrow and securing his spot on NFL draft boards. Then everything went crazy. That resilience he showed at Alabama is the exact reason why the Philadelphia Eagles decided to draft him. But Philly fans, including myself, were not happy about the pick. When Philadelphia took Hurts at 53 overall in the 2020 draft, the backlash was immediate and ugly, and I was definitely one of those people. This had nothing to do with Hurts as a player specifically, but mostly to do with the selection implied for the franchise. Carson Wentz had just signed a massive 4-year extension worth $128 million the previous year, so the fan base was already committed to him. General Manager Howie Roseman stood at the podium and claimed drafting Hurts was not a threat to Carson, but nobody in the city believed him. As it turns out, the skeptics were right to worry because Carson completely collapsed during the 2020 season. He looked totally lost while throwing 15 interceptions in just 12 games, which forced the Eagles to bench their high-priced star mid-season. Hurts stepped into the starting role and managed to go 3-1, providing a spark that the veterans simply couldn't find. The offense was far from perfect since his throws were inconsistent and his mechanics were a work in progress, but he won games with a struggling roster during a lost season. Philly saw enough to make a choice, so they decided to trade Carson to Indianapolis that offseason and officially handed Hurts the keys to the team. The question that followed him into the 2021 season was simple. Is he actually a franchise QB, or is he just a guy who can run? His stat line that year included 3,144 passing yards with 16 touchdowns and 9 interceptions, which was enough to drag the team into the playoffs. However, those numbers didn't do much to shut down the actual critics who pointed to his struggles with hitting guys over the middle of the field and bailing out of clean pockets. Everything came to a head during the wildcard game against Tampa Bay, where the Eagles lost 31-15 in a game that never felt close. Hurts threw for 258 yards, but the offense never truly threatened the Buccaneers team that took control by the second quarter. That loss hardened the narrative against him, giving the he can't throw crowd all the evidence they needed to complain about every hesitation and every scramble. What that harsh criticism missed was the actual context of the situation the young quarterback was dealing with at the time. The Eagles were still in the middle of building a roster around him, meaning A.J. Brown wasn't in the building yet, and the offensive line hadn't reached its peak. Patience is never a popular idea in a city like Philly, and it certainly isn't popular in the world of sports media either. The gadget player label started to stick as the debate over his passing ability ran on a constant loop throughout the following offseason. Expectations after trading for A.J. Brown heading into 2022 were a mix of cautious hope and open skepticism because the Eagles needed Jalen to take a massive leap. And with that being said, I want to give a huge thank you to Calcy for being our sponsor on today's video. Since we're talking about Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles, I had to check out what the market was for the Eagles' chances at winning the NFC East during the 2026 season. Calcy is the largest legal prediction market in the US with over 1 million users. Right now, you can trade on whether you think the Philadelphia Eagles are going to win the NFC East. The contract sits at 42 cents, which means the market thinks there's a 42% chance that this actually happens. If you trade 42 cents and you're right, you get $1 per contract. What's cool about Calcy is that it's peer-to-peer trading, no sportsbook tilting odds against you or limiting your trades when you start winning. Plus, it's available in all 50 states. If you want to try it out, Calcy's giving away $20 to anybody who uses my link down below and also trades $20. Thanks again to Calcy for sponsoring this video, and let's get back into it. The 2022 season turned out to be everything the critics claimed wouldn't be possible with Hurts' skill set. He silenced the doubters by throwing for 3,701 yards and 22 touchdowns while only giving up 6 interceptions all year. He added another 760 yards and 13 scores on the ground, leading the Eagles to a dominant 14-3 record and a top seed. When he finished second in MVP voting behind Patrick Mahomes, it felt like the world finally acknowledged he had made the biggest jump of any quarterback in the league. The can't throw crowd didn't disappear entirely, but they definitely went quiet for a while. The Super Bowl against Kansas City should have been the moment that settled the debate once and for all over his talent. Hurts put up a historic stat line with 304 passing yards and 70 rushing yards while accounting for 3 total touchdowns on the biggest stage. No player in the history of the NFL had ever hit those specific benchmarks in a single game, whether it was the regular season or playoffs. He even broke the Super Bowl record for rushing yards by a QB that had been held by Steve McNair for years. Many analysts called it the greatest performance by a losing player in the history of the big game. Despite that legendary performance, the Eagles still lost 38-35 after a late field goal by Harrison Butker deciding the outcome. Within 48 hours of the confetti falling, the conversation shifted away from his brilliance and focused almost entirely on one specific mistake. People stopped talking about the 300 yards and started obsessing over the fumble that happened in the second quarter. Jalen took a QB draw and fumbled the ball where Nick Bolton scooped it up for a 36-yard scoop and scored a touchdown. It was a 14-point swing in a game decided by a single field goal, so people still act like that one play cost him the ring. The Philly actually lost because the defense couldn't get a stop when it mattered the most, allowing Sky Moore to score a wide open touchdown, which I'm still pretty upset about if you can't tell. Yet the fumble was an easy visual for the media to use during their post-game autopsies. Regardless, the team showed their faith by signing Hurts to a 5-year extension worth $255 million that following April. At the time of the signing, it was the highest average annual salary in the history of the NFL. While the contract made sense given the market and his production, it gave his critics a permanent target to attack. His supporting cast started to be brought into the fold as well. While it's true that every great quarterback benefits from a great supporting cast, the framing was used against Hurts in a way other stars never have to deal with, and the goalposts had been moved again. Philly had entered the 2023 season as the clear favorite to represent the NFC in the Super Bowl again though. They had the veteran roster, a quarterback on a massive new extension, and a defense that had just pushed Patrick Mahomes to the limit on the game's biggest stage. Through the first 11 weeks, the Eagles sat at 10-1 and looked like the best team in football, which shifted the conversation from whether they could get back to the Super Bowl to whether anyone could actually stop them from winning. Then the wheels fell off in a way nobody saw coming as they lost 6 of their last 7 games and got embarrassed in the wildcard round by Tampa Bay. This wasn't a close game or a couple of bad bounces, but a 32-9 blowout at the hands of a team they had beaten earlier in the year. The fallout started with offensive coordinator Brian Johnson losing his job. He had been the quarterback's coach during the Super Bowl run and moved up when Shane Steichen left for Indianapolis. But the offense never seemed to find a rhythm or an identity under his leadership. Reports began to leak out about tension behind the scenes regarding the offensive system. Sources claim Hurts didn't want to go under center, that he was changing too many plays at the line of scrimmage, and that he was more interested in playing his own way than following the script. These claims always came from anonymous sources without any real names or real accountability. But if you repeat them enough times, people start treating them like they're established facts. The coverage mostly ignored how bad the defense was during that final stretch of the season. They were giving up 35 points a game, the pass rush that had been historic the year before completely disappeared, and several key starters started playing the worst football of their careers at the exact same time. Jalen didn't say a word to defend himself though, and he didn't try to shift the blame to any of his coaches. He stayed quiet and went back to work, getting ready for another bounce-back season. Philly didn't wait around to fix any messes though. Howie Roseman immediately brought in Vic Fangio to fix the defense and Kellen Moore to fix the offense. They also made a huge splash by signing Saquon Barkley in free agency, and the 2024 Eagles responded by going 14-3 and winning the NFC East. While the team was winning games during the regular season, a weird side story started to develop. Brandon Graham mentioned on a local radio show that Hurts and AJ Brown used to be friends, but that things had changed between them. Graham tried to take it back almost immediately and apologized for making assumptions, and both Hurts and Brown told the media that there was no issue, but nobody really believed that, especially with AJ Brown reading books on the sideline. By the time January rolled around, they looked like the most complete team in the league, and Hurts finished the year with 25 touchdowns and only 6 interceptions, while making his third Pro Bowl. Saquon was incredible and rushed for over 2,000 yards, but his success actually gave the critics a new way to attack Jalen. The new argument was that Barkley was doing all the heavy lifting while Jalen was just managing the games from a clean pocket because defenses were terrified of the run. People started calling him a $255 million game manager who was just hitching a ride on a Hall of Fame running back and a dominant defense. Super Bowl 59 against the Chiefs was supposed to be the ultimate test for Hurts. It definitely provided an answer, but it didn't do much to stop the noise from the people who were determined to doubt him. The Eagles dominated the game and won 40-22 in a matchup that was never really competitive. Jalen was efficient and productive, finishing with over 220 passing yards, 2 scores through the air, and another 72 yards and a TD on the ground. He took home the Super Bowl MVP trophy and joined Tom Brady and Joe Burrow as the only quarterbacks to ever beat Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs so far. It took the national media about 3 days to figure out how to spin the win. Suddenly, the defense deserved all the credit, or the Chiefs were just too banged up to compete. Every talking point was designed to explain away the Eagles' success as something other than about to get more ammunition than they ever dreamed of. 2025 season kicked off with high hopes and a team that looked ready to dominate until Jalen Carter spit on Dak Prescott. The offense looked pretty rough from the get-go, and new offensive coordinator Kevin Patulio seemed in over his head. However, they were stacking wins and suffocating opponents because of their defense. When January rolled around, the small cracks in the foundation had turned into massive craters that swallowed their season whole. If you just look at the stat sheet, Jalen Hurts put up numbers that seemed perfectly fine. He threw for 3,224 yards with 25 TDs, which was enough to earn him his 4th Pro Bowl nod and another NFC East title. The problem is that the box score doesn't tell the full story of how broken this unit felt. The offense plummeted to 19th in scoring and 24th in total yards, marking a staggering decline for a group that had lived at the top of the league for 2 straight years. Saquon Barkley finished with 1,140 yards on the ground, and the passing game never found a rhythm that lasted more than a couple of weeks. They couldn't stay on the field, finishing 24th in 3rd down conversions, which led to a constant cycle of punts and 3 and outs. When you have a roster this talented, those specific metrics represent a total failure in how the offense was actually executed. Things got messy in the middle of the season when AJ Brown decided to make his frustrations public, and making it clear he wasn't going to apologize for being honest about it. Even though he finished the year with 78 catches for over 1,000 yards and 7 scores, his sideline demeanor became a massive talking point for the media every single week. Brown insisted his anger wasn't about his own targets, arguing instead that the offense was failing and the defense couldn't keep bailing him out forever. It was a blunt assessment of the situation, but that kind of public honesty usually ends up hurting the quarterback more than anyone else. After just 1 season on the job, Kevin Patulio was fired as offensive coordinator. This meant Hurts was heading to another year with another play caller, a revolving door that always seemed to spark new debates about who was actually to blame for the lack of continuity. The situation boiled over after the season when ESPN released a massive long-form article that pulled back the entire curtain on the locker room. Anonymous sources claimed Jalen had rigid preferences and frequently clashed with the coaches about lining up under center. According to the report, he was changing plays at the line way too often and refused to stick with new concepts if they didn't work immediately. Now Philadelphia is turning to Sean Mannion to fix the mess. He's only 33 years old and has never called plays in the NFL, but he is tasked with installing a system heavy on under center runs and pre-snap motion. This is the exact style of play that Hurts has reportedly fought against in the past. Whether they can find a middle ground or if the friction will tear the room apart is the biggest question hanging over the team as they look forward to 2026. So what's the reality of the situation? AJ Brown has kind of requested a trade, but not really. It's never made it public, and the Eagles keep claiming that he's there to stay. But the cycle of hate surrounding Jalen Hurts follows a very specific pattern that's hard to ignore once you recognize it. When the Eagles are winning, everyone gets a slice of the credit, from the offensive line and the defense to the scheme and the star running backs. But the second things go sideways, the blame is placed entirely on the quarterback's shoulders. People point to fumbles, picks, and the rigid style of play as if he's the only reason the team struggles. We have to acknowledge that some of the criticism is fair. The collapse at the end of 2023 was a disaster, and his play was a big part of that. The way the offense stalled out in 2025 was definitely a problem, and his reported refusal to adapt certainly didn't help the situation. Even the drama with AJ Brown is a legitimate concern regardless of what happened behind closed doors. None of those mistakes go away just because he has a winning record. However, the level of noise surrounding his failures is completely out of proportion when you compare him to any other quarterback with his resume. Since arriving in Philly, he's gone 57-25 with 2 Super Bowl trips and a Super Bowl MVP trophy on his mantle. He's made 4 Pro Bowls, earned a second-team All-Pro, and remains one of the only active quarterbacks to actually take down Patrick Mahomes in the postseason. The games show a winner, but the narrative says something else entirely. Hurts has spent his whole life turning doubters into believers, and the 2026 season will finally show us if he's writing another comeback story, or if at the end of that, things get a little bit weird in Philly. So there you have it. Watch this next video if you haven't already, and subscribe if you're new. Thanks for watching.